Good evening. I'm Katie Fang in for Joy Reid, and we begin tonight with the rise and fall of Matt Gaetz. Today, the House Ethics Committee revealed that it found substantial evidence that the former Republican congressman had sex with a 17-year-old girl in 2017 and that he regularly paid women for sex while he was in Congress. The 42-page report concluded that the committee, quote, determined there is substantial evidence that Representative Gaetz violated House rules and other standards of conduct prohibiting prostitution, statutory rape, illicit drug use, impermissible gifts, special favors or privileges, and obstruction of Congress. Committee investigators said they tracked 12 different women from 2017 to 2020. The committee concluded that most of the payments were likely connected to sexual activity and or drug use. Gaetz has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing, and on Monday, in a series of posts on X, he denied paying for sex. Earlier this morning, Gaetz filed a lawsuit seeking to get federal court to block the Ethics Committee from releasing the damning report. He has also noted that a separate DOJ investigation into allegations of sex trafficking ended with no charges. The Justice Department declined to comment on the House Ethics Committee Matt Gaetz report. It also has not commented on why it decided not to file charges. Last month, after Donald Trump initially picked him to be his attorney general, Gaetz withdrew from consideration amid concerns from senators about allegations of sexual misconduct. But over the weekend, Gaetz teased the possibility of running for the United States Senate during a Turning Point USA event in Arizona.
It seems I may not have had enough support in the United States Senate. Maybe I'll just run for Marco Rubio's vacant seat in the United States Senate and join some of those folks.
Joining me now is Paul Butler, MSNBC legal analyst and a former federal prosecutor, and David Jolly, MSNBC political analyst and a former Republican congressman. My thanks to both of you gentlemen for getting us started. Paul, I got to start with you, former federal prosecutor. I mean, the evidence in this case is salacious and wild, and yet it's evidence. So I want to emphasize that for our viewers right now, Paul. This is evidence that this House Ethics Committee considered. It includes things like a $1,600 check from Joel Greenberg, a convicted felon who's doing time in a Florida prison right now. That was a check to Matt Gaetz. There are several text messages between a contact listed as, quote, Matt Gaetz, and unknown or redacted individuals with references to hotel meetups and drugs. I mean, Paul, what more did this report tell you and tell Americans about a former congressman's conduct?
It told us that these investigators found receipts, that they have evidence that probably would have gotten him kicked out of Congress, and if referred to a prosecutor, could have him indicted on federal charges. The evidence includes Venmo and Zelle and Cash App payments for sex workers and for drugs. There's also evidence beyond the sex that Gaetz obstructed Congress, he misled the investigators, and he may have even committed crimes involving failing to report these gifts, like these trips, on his financial disclosure forms. And so we can certainly understand, Katie, why Gaetz fought the release of this report tooth and nail. He went to court as late as today, trying to get an injunction and protective order, because he said if this came out, it would ruin his reputation. It would cause severe and permanent damage. And so it has.
You know, David, I have to point out the investigation began April 2021. The House Ethics Committee put it on the back burner because the DOJ said it was doing its own investigation. But according to this report, there were 9 requests for information, 6 FOIA requests, 29 subpoenas for documents and testimony, 14,000 documents, more than 24 witnesses. This was probably one of the most thorough investigations done by a congressional committee. And the results that have come from this investigation, I emphasize the adjective that they're salacious, but they're criminal in nature.
Yeah, they certainly are. And I think there's a lot of questions. Why did DOJ not bring case against Matt Gaetz when they did against Joel Greenberg? Importantly, there were some other allegations against Joel Greenberg that actually ultimately brought him down. I think as a county or city executive, he illegally tapped into some DMV records. They had Joel Greenberg on some other matters. And there's a hard question. Why not Matt Gaetz in this situation? Some would point to the fact that he's the privileged son of a very powerful and financially well-off political family in the state of Florida. Others are an indictment of our own justice system. Sometimes it's hard. Victims make bad witnesses. And this is the kind of the most important point of today. There's a victim that is identified in this report, an underage child a child who, based on the allegations in the report, the credible information, would be a victim of statutory rape. And so why then does the House Ethics Committee release the report? First, they have a different standard than the court system. Theirs is a congressional standard. They can do whatever they want. But I think the reason they released it, even though it's well known Matt resigned so that he was outside the jurisdiction of the Congress, the committee told us, one, there is an overwhelming public interest, and that's true. In an allegation of drug use and statutory rape by a sitting member of Congress, there's a public interest, particularly, I suppose, when they're still relevant politically to either an incoming position with Donald Trump or a future political race. But I think ultimately it's because Matt Gaetz obstructed and manipulated the investigation. As you mentioned, the 4-year investigation, he did not cooperate with it. He actually manipulated the House Ethics Committee, the norms of the Congress. And ultimately at the end, when he couldn't play it out through December or through this coming January 3rd, he resigned to try to remove jurisdiction. I think the House Ethics Committee said to the world today, look, we have to defend the institution of the House. We cannot be played by a bad actor amongst ourselves in Congress. And therefore, though it's not entirely unprecedented but unusual, it's important that we release the report to say to the likes of Matt Gaetz, you don't get to use the Congress and use the norms of our institution to actually hide your own wrongdoing.
Paul, let's turn, I think, a decidedly and well-earned critical eye to the Department of Justice. The DOJ commenting, basically saying, right, to the extent possible, we don't release evidence in an investigation when somebody isn't charged by the DOJ. But to David's point, though, it's one thing to not charge Matt Gaetz, but it's a whole other thing from what we've read in this report, Paul. The DOJ didn't cooperate with this House Ethics Committee, when they asked for this information, when they told the DOJ to give the information over, the DOJ hemmed and hawed. And so it's really hard not to say the DOJ fumbled this one and badly.
So the report says that the committee didn't find evidence of federal sex trafficking, which is the most likely federal charge for Gaetz, because even though Gaetz was responsible for transporting the sex workers across state lines, and none of the women were under 18 at the time of the travel, and the commercial transactions involving sex work were all voluntary. So typically, the Justice Department only brings those kinds of charges if there's coercion involved, or if there's a minor, or if there's some threat of force. Reportedly, there's none of that. But yeah, why wouldn't they then turn over this information to the Congress so that it could do what it needs to do, especially since at the time Gaetz was still a member. Not only was he a member, we know that he was in line to be Trump's attorney general. We don't know. The department doesn't release its declination memos. Those are the long reports when it does an investigation and decides not to bring charges with why not. As David suggested, the standard for a criminal conviction is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's higher than the substantial evidence that this report found. But one other thing, Katie, Joel Greenberg, who is Gaetz's alleged partner in crime, he's doing 11 years in federal prison. No doubt that he's credible. The judge who sentenced him said he never, in 22 years of being a judge, found a witness who so supported, who was so helpful in bringing in his providing information about the case. So we'll never know because the department doesn't release why it declines cases, but it's strange.
David, let's talk about a criticism that some people have about the timing of the release of this report. They're saying, well, who cares? Some people are saying Matt Gaetz has withdrawn his name from consideration to be the Attorney General of the United States, which in and of itself is absurd, right? This idea that somebody, and by the way, this is the report. It's not like just the 42 pages. I mean, all of this is the evidence that was being considered here. But like, I get it. He withdrew his name, David, but what does it say about the fact that Donald Trump, Mike Johnson, other Republicans were very loudly saying that this was our guy for the top cop of the United States?
I'm so glad you frame it like that. Look, the scrutiny should be on Matt Gaetz, and if he has a political future, renewed scrutiny should he run for office again. But just as much tonight should be the scrutiny on Donald Trump and Mike Johnson, because we know Donald Trump shattered all the norms, right? Someone who has been found civilly liable for sexual abuse apparently doesn't matter to the American voters. And apparently the allegations against Matt Gaetz didn't matter to Donald Trump either. That's an indictment of where the Republican Party is today and where its leadership is. But bring in Mike Johnson as well, who said this report shouldn't be released. I'm sympathetic, having worked for 30 years with or within or without the House, somehow adjacent to the House of Representatives. I deeply believe in the norms of the House. But this is where Mike Johnson got it wrong. Matt Gaetz manipulated the ethics process. He pulled a Donald Trump. He tried to do everything Donald Trump did with the courts. Matt Gaetz tried to do with the House Ethics Committee. And Mike Johnson helped him at the end. Mike Johnson said to Republicans on the committee, don't release it. And the Republican co-chair of the committee apparently opposed releasing it. He wrote a dissenting report. He even said, I don't disagree with the findings, but we shouldn't release the findings. Look, at some point, the standard for performing in Republican politics should be above the bar of credible allegations of statutory rape or above the bar of credible allegations of sexual abuse. It's not hard, Republicans, to go find candidates and elected members that don't have credible allegations of sexual misconduct. They're out there if you go look for them. They're not finding them right now, and so we have a party led by Donald Trump and elevating the likes of Matt Gaetz.